I want to begin today with a really fascinating report. This is from Pew Research Center, and it's looking at the ways that the American population breaks down politically. And unlike the sort of typical report where you have red, blue, and then independent, this one tries to break down Americans into political typology. And so they break down Americans into essentially 9 categories: 4 on the right or leaning right, 4 on the left or leaning left, and then you have what they call the stressed sideliners. And this study demonstrates pretty clearly how the Democratic shift to the left is leaving behind a lot of people, and it explains why exactly the Republican Party is in good shape for 2022. So according to Pew, there are 2 very different groups of liberal Democrats: progressive left and establishment liberals. Progressive left, the only majority white non-Hispanic group of Democrats, have very liberal views on virtually every issue. They support far-reaching changes to address racial injustice and expand the social safety net. Establishment liberals, while just as liberal in many ways as the progressive left, are far less persuaded of the need for sweeping change. There are 2 other Democratic-aligned groups that couldn't be more different from each other, both demographically and in their relationship to the Democratic Party. You got the Democratic mainstays, that is the largest Democratic-oriented group, as well as the oldest on average. These are unshakable Democratic loyalists and have a moderate tilt on some issues. And then you have the outsider left, the youngest typology group. They voted overwhelmingly for Biden a year ago. They're liberal in a lot of their views, but they are deeply frustrated with the political system, including the Democratic Party and its leaders. Then you have 4 Republican-oriented groups. So you have 3 groups of conservatives: the faith and flag conservatives, who are intensely conservative across the board, far more likely than all other typology groups to say government policies should support religious values, and compromise in politics is selling out what you believe in. You've got committed conservatives who express conservative views across the board. They're a little bit softer on immigration and America's place in the world. And then you have the populist right, who are slightly less educated in terms of number of degrees. They're the most likely to live in rural areas. They are highly critical of immigrants and major U.S. corporations. This would be kind of the Trumpy wing of the Republican Party. Then you have the ambivalent right. This is the youngest and least conservative GOP-aligned group. They're conservative about the size of government. They're economically conservative, but they are fairly liberal when it comes to drugs, for example, or abortion and social issues. They don't like Trump very much. A majority voted for him in 2020, but a lot of them are not big on Trump. Okay, then you have the stressed sideliners. Okay, the stressed sideliners is the group with the lowest level of political engagement. They make up 15% of the public. They constituted just 10% of voters in 2020. They have a mix of conservative and liberal views, but they are largely defined by their minimal interest in politics. Okay, now the way that these numbers break down in the American population is that the faith and flag conservatives are about 10% of the population. Committed conservatives are about 7% of the population. That'd be sort of the old Reagan conservatives. The populist right is 11% of the population. And the ambivalent right, the people who are sort of younger and less politically engaged, they're about 12% of the American population. So overall on the right, you've got about 40% of the American population. Then you have the stressed sideliners, or about 15% of the American population. So you got 40 R's and 15 stressed sideliners who break down fairly evenly by party. And then you have the Democratic coalition, which represents about 45% of the American population. Okay, so what does this mean? It means that much of America's political battle is over those stressed sideliners. And if Democrats continue to skew to the left, to the progressive left particularly, they're in a lot of trouble. So if you are to create sort of a political spectrum from right to left, on the far right here, you have the faith and flag conservatives. And then on the far left, you have the progressive left. Faith and flag conservatives are a lot closer in orientation to the stressed sideliners than the progressive left are. The progressive left stress people out. They stress them out in a very, very serious way. And they are 6% of the American population. They are the lowest percent of any political typology, but they are also the most engaged element of the Democratic left. They have enormous control over the direction in which the Democratic left moves right now. And particularly, they are outspoken about not just environmental issues, but particularly on racial issues. The woke crowd, the progressive left woke crowd, which is driving the bus in the Democratic Party right now, they are not in line with the vast majority of Americans on a lot of these issues. According to Pew, perhaps no issue is more divisive than racial injustice in the United States. Among the 4 Republican-oriented typology groups, no more than about a quarter say a lot more needs to be done to ensure equal rights for all Americans, regardless of racial or ethnic background. By comparison, no fewer than 3/4 of any Democratic group say a lot more needs to be done to achieve this goal. However, Democrats differ over whether the changes to ensure equal rights for all can be achieved by working within the system, or whether most laws and institutions need to be completely rebuilt. progressive left and outsider left are far more likely than the other two Democratic groups to say systemic change is needed to combat racial bias. Okay, so this has always been a battle inside the Democratic Party, the battle between the revolutionaries and between the people who say that we need to give the government lots of power so the government can restructure America from the inside. And Barack Obama sort of bridged that gap in 2008, 2012. But now that gap has emerged again, and the progressive left seems to be in charge. On the right, a lot of the divisions are actually economic in nature, believe it or not. So Republicans tend to be very much in favor of limited government, but the populist right diverges sharply from traditional GOP positions with their negative view of corporations. Only 17% say most corporations make a fair profit, which means that you have sort of a horseshoe theory Republican Party in the progressive right. What does this mean? It means that there's not a lot of middle in American politics. If there is a cohesive middle in American politics, it is just about who pisses them off more. It really is not about there being a lot of shared values in the middle of the American spectrum. Pew says that there is obviously broad support for a third major political party, but that is not going to materialize because the middle is not one group of people. Those stressed sideliners, they disagree on a lot of issues. The stressed sideliners, outsider left and ambivalent right, who are the closest to the middle of the political spectrum here, quote, have very little in common politically. Stressed sideliners hold mixed views. Ambivalent right are conservative on many economic issues, while moderate on some social issues. Outsider left are very liberal on most issues, especially on race and the social safety net. What these groups do have in common is relatively low interest in politics. They had the lowest rates of voting in the 2020 presidential election and are less likely than other groups to follow government and public affairs most of the time. Okay, so this leads both parties to have to make a decision. The decision is, do we cater to the people who are the most engaged? So for the right, that would be the faith and flag conservatives who represent about a quarter of the base. And on the left, that would be the progressive coalition, which only represents about 12% of the Democratic coalition. Or do we aim for those stressed sideliners? Now, the good news for the Republican Party is that with the Democrats in power catering to the far left, you can cater to both the base and the stressed sideliners. Because the stressed sideliners are just ping-ponging back and forth based on who stresses them out, as the name would sort of suggest. They're not motivated to get up off their butts and vote in favor of an agenda, but they may be motivated to get up and vote by something that they really, really, really dislike. They didn't show up a lot in 2020. If they did show up, they voted overwhelmingly for Biden because Trump stressed them out. Now, if they get up and they vote, presumably they're not going to vote for Joe Biden. So the Democratic coalition is essentially being run at this point by the segment that is the smallest in their coalition, but also the most politically engaged. And that is pretty scary if you're a Democratic strategist. If you're James Carville, you got to be freaking out right now because the political engagement among typology groups shows that faith and flag conservatives, who represent about 23% of the Republican population and 10% of the American population overall, are the most engaged Republicans. Committed conservatives and populist right are also pretty engaged. However, the most engaged by far on the left are the progressive left, by far. And they represent a tiny constituency inside the general American population. That is a serious problem for the Democratic Party. And then you look to how political typology groups view major issues, and you can see that the progressive left is really out of touch with the stressed sideliners, with the people who are closer to the middle. Right? They're extremely far to the left is the bottom line, especially when you get to racial issues. On economic issues, they're not as disconnected from everybody else as you might think. But when it comes to social issues, they are way the hell out there. Like really, really far out there. So for example, look at the stats right now on the question of who does a lot more need to be done to ensure equal rights for all Americans, regardless of their racial or ethnic background. So virtually everybody on the right says that's not a major issue. The people who are the stressed sideliners, about 50% say yes, 50% say no. Nearly 100% of the progressive left says that a lot more needs to be done. 75% of the progressive left says that they have strong support for Black Lives Matter, the movement. Okay, the rest of the Democratic Party is averaging about 50%, and the stressed sideliners are down there at about 13%. If you look at the question of whether there is a lot of discrimination against Black people in society, 80% of the progressive left says yes, and that is mirrored, they're dragging the party to the left, that is mirrored by establishment liberals, Democratic mainstays, and even the outsider left. But the stressed sideliners are down at about 40% on the question of whether there's a lot of discrimination against Black people in society. And again, these are serious disconnects. for the Democratic Party on the issue of the day, the embrace of equity politics as the driving force in Democratic politics, or the embrace of radical environmentalism, which you've seen from this administration. I understand why they're doing it. They're attacking that way because these are the activists. But if you become hostage to the activist class, you have a real serious problem on your hands. Like a very serious problem. Look at the progressive left when it comes to belief in God. Okay, here's a question in this poll. It is important for a person to believe in God in order to be considered good and moral. So virtually everybody from the center to the right says yes. Okay, in terms of like a majority of every group, including stressed sideliners, say yes. In fact, stressed sideliners are more likely than the ambivalent right to say it's important for a person to believe in God. Only about 12% of progressives say it's important for a person to believe in God to be considered good and moral. Unbelievably enough, it looks like about 5 to 10% of progressive leftists say society is better off if people make marriage and having children a priority. Now, what's amazing about that stat, and what is devastating for the future of the country, by the way, is that really only faith and flag conservatives believe by broad majorities that society is better off if people make having marriage and children a priority. Like only, it's kind of amazing. Like even members of the populist right or the ambivalent right are not super sold on marriage and kids, which is really, really not a good sign for the rest of America. But even so, the position that God is kind of important in life is rejected by broad swaths of the progressive left, but nobody else. Nobody else. And so on this is why you wonder why social issues matter so much to Americans, because social issues do define the future of the country. And the progressive left is driving the bus on those social issues. Who's got two thumbs and wants you to like and subscribe?